Alright, so let's talk about chapter 6, which will be on seaweeds and marine plants. So the difference between seaweeds and marine plants are basically this. Seaweeds are not considered true plants because if you look at their structure there, typically true plants will have a root system, whereas seaweeds do not have a root system. They have what's known as a holdfast. And a holdfast looks like a root system, but the seaweed does not get any nutrients from the root system like plants do. So pretty much the main purpose of that holdfast is just as it suggests, is it holds the seaweed onto whatever rock or substrate that it's on, and that's basically what it uses to secure itself to that substrate. So that's pretty much the purpose of the holdfast. There's no nutrients being gathered from that holdfast that looks like a root system. Unlike marine plants, their root system does collect nutrients from its roots, and it also provides some structure in the sense of being able to hold it in the substrate. But going back to the seaweeds, so you have the holdfast, and then you also have the frond structure. That frond structure, you have the blades, which are the leaves. You have a gas bladder, which are those round balls, and those are filled with gas, and they are meant to hold up the frond. So if the seaweed didn't have these gas bladders, the frond wouldn't be able to hold itself up. So it's just an additional way of keeping it upright so that it can get the needed sunlight it needs to do photosynthesis. And then it has a stipe. The stipe would be like your stem, but the stipe doesn't have the structure needed to hold up the frond, so that's the reason why the gas bladders are there. And that's contrasting to marine plants, where you do have a stem and you have a leaf blade, but the stem is strong enough to hold up the leaves, the whole plant itself, so that it doesn't need gas bladders. And also too, it does some of the different parts are, basically a marine plant is similarly, the different parts of a marine plant are named similarly to land plants. All right. The only difference is they do they probably do similar to some plants, like say lilycoy. If you guys are familiar with lilycoy or any sort of vine-like plant on land, marine plants are very similar to that, where you have an adult plant that has a root system, and it sends out a rhizome. And that rhizome is just a special root that extends out, and it gets to a point where it has a favorable condition, and it hits a node, and at that node a new plant will grow from it, and then that new plant will then extend out another rhizome and then another node, and it'll grow out another plant. So you'll get whole lines of marine plants, and they're all clones of each other. They're all the same, and that's pretty much how they generally will reproduce. They can do sexual reproduction, and so these marine plants will, in a sense, flower, so they can do sexual reproduction. But both seaweeds and marine plants are autotrophic, and they do contain chlorophyll, and some even contain carotenoids, which gives it a more brownish color. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Let's just start off with algae. Algae have three main types of macro. This is talking about macroalgae now, so the ones that you can actually see. There's a whole bunch of different microalgae algae that are microscopic, but we'll just talk about the macroalgae for now. So the three main types are green, brown, and red. Pretty simple, right? So you have your green one on the top there, the red one on the bottom, and the brown one off to the right side there. So let's talk about each one separately now. Your green algae, these are all examples of green algae that we have here in Hawaii. And green algae can be freshwater or marine. How do you say? They can be found in both environments. Green algae tend to be tropics and subtropical regions. They prefer the warmer temperatures, so you generally won't find them in temperate regions or in the polar regions because they tend to need more sunlight than the other two types of algae. The different structures that you can have for green algae, you can have a simple thallus, which is the top right hand image there. That is known as ova algae or sea lettuce. It's a very maybe that might be the paper thin sheets. Anyways, that particular algae is very delicate. Then you can have filamentous, which is the bottom left hand image there. It's really hard to see, but if you were to see it, it basically just looks like thin fibers of green algae. Then you can have paper thin sheets, which actually might be the ova on the top right hand corner there. You can have tubes and balls. So the middle image there of the green balls, that's a type of algae that's kind of moss-like in texture. And then the tube one is the bottom middle image, and that is, I believe that's Halimeda. No, Halimeda is the right hand image, but that tube one, that would be one. And then you also have Calcareous, which is the bottom right hand image, and that is Halimeda. That is a native species to Hawaii, and it creates a calcium carbonate structure to its blades. And so when you actually feel this type of algae, it's pretty hard. So that's just some types of structures to the green algae. Your brown algae is next, and your brown algae still has chlorophyll, but it is contains scratch that. It contains fucoxanthin instead of chlorophyll. So fucoxanthin is a brown pigment that is similar to chlorophyll, and it still does photosynthesis, but all brown algae will have fucoxanthin instead of chlorophyll. And majority of the brown algae is marine, so typically you should not find brown algae in freshwater environments. And typically they tend to like polar and temperate regions instead of the tropics. So these particular algae like the colder temperatures, not so much the warmer temperatures. And the different types that you can have filamentous, which is that bottom middle image right there. You can see it looks like very fine strings all mushed together in one little ball. You can have calcareous, which is the top right image there. That is an image of Podina, and that is a native species to Hawaii. That one you can see it creates, the blades have calcium carbonate in them. And then the next type is thick and leathery. So the middle right image there is an example of a thick and leathery type of algae. You can have ones that have gas-filled floats. So the middle image and the bottom right-hand image are examples of brown algae that have gas floats. So you can see those round balls are the gas floats, and they help the blades and the whole frond stay afloat. And then you can have kelp forests, which is the middle image right there. So you can have these giant kelp frond structures. And if anybody has been to, let's say, Monterey Bay or San Francisco, you can see these giant kelp forests right off the coast there. All right, so the last one will be red algae. And red algae does contain chlorophyll, but is masked by the phycobilins. So phycobilins is a red pigment that allows for photosynthesis. And majority of the red algae actually looks red. So these examples that I have here, but some of them can look green and some of them can look brown, but they're actually red algae. So red algae is the exception to these ones because it can be any color, but it will still be considered a red algae. Some have lost their chlorophyll, so they no longer can do photosynthesis, so they would be considered heterotrophic because they would have to get their energy from a different source. And red algae you can find just about anywhere in the ocean. They range from the polar region to the tropics, and they can either be in the colder area, in the colder water temperature, or they can be in the warmer water temperatures. Just depends on what species you're talking about. You can have filamentous, which is the top right hand image over there. You can have long flat blades, which is the bottom left hand image there. You can see the dude holding up two very large red algae blades. That's typically what you'll see in Japan when they are farming for algae so they can make nori. You can have large blades, which is also very similar to the bottom left hand image. You can have calcareous, which is a tube. The middle and the bottom middle and the bottom right hand images are images of calcareous. And encrusting, so encrusting is the bottom right hand. So the bottom right hand one is not only calcareous, but it is also encrusting. All right. So what is the life cycle of an algae? Typically they will do asexual reproduction, which includes spores. And these spores are specialized cells that disperse to new locations. And when they get to a new location, they will touch the bottom, and then if it's favorable, in terms of like there's a lot of nutrients around, it's the right type of substrate to attach to, then they will settle down and metamorphose into an adult, or into an algae plant, and then grow up into an adult. Zoospores. So spores don't have flagella. They just kind of use the ocean's currents to get from place to place. Zoospores are basically spores, but with a flagella. So they can actually swim to some degree, but mostly they rely on the ocean's currents to get them from place to place. Algae can do sexual reproduction. It's not as common as asexual reproduction, but they do go through mitosis and meiosis, and each species does it a little bit differently, but red algae will have male gametes that do not have flagella, but majority of the time the gametes will have flagella, and they will create a spore cell, which is like a specialized spore cell that will go into a sexual stage and then release gametes, and the gametes will combine to create a zygote, and then you get a whole new plant from that. So it's different depending on what species you're talking about, but either way, whether you have an algae that produces a spore cell that turns into like a sexual stage plant that creates the gametes, or in the case of Halimeda, you just have a blade that releases gametes. Either way, you're still doing the same process. Economically, algae is very important, not only for agriculture, but also for fuel. So in agriculture, a lot of countries will farm algae, not only for food, but also for chemicals. We get a lot of different chemicals out of algae, as well as medicine and industrial purposes. And biofuel, as we should all be familiar with, um, can be used to run certain machinery. Aquaculture. So let's just cover aquaculture a little bit more in detail. So there's a number of different products that we get from algae. Many species of algae are edible, so we can eat them. If you guys are all familiar with eating poke bowls, you are eating algae in most cases, because the type of algae that they put in poke is known as gorilla ogo, which is a type of gracilaria. It's native to Hawaii, and it's very delicious. At least I think so, anyways. But if you guys ever eat a spam musubi or any sort of sushi and it comes with nori on it, you're eating algae. So, yeah, that's pretty much what you're eating. But you can also get iodine from algae, and that's typically used to help people with thyroid issues. A lot of times, if you buy salt from the grocery store, it'll generally say, oh, it has iodine added into it, and that's to prevent thyroid issues. But you can also get gelatin from algae. So you can get gelatin-like products, I should say. You can get algin, which is used as a thickener or stabilizer in a lot of foods. You can get carrageenan, which is an emulsifier. Typically, you'll find that either like in toothpaste, or anything that kind of needs something to hold it together, basically. And then you can get agar, which is used either in medical or food products. So you can find agar in a lot of foods, actually. Or if you've taken microbiology and if you've taken the lab and you've you've grown bacteria, those that jelly-like material that's used to grow the bacteria in the petri dish, that's agar. Right. And so that was pretty much it for algae. For marine plants, they are also known as angiosperms, but a lot of times you'll have three different types of marine plants, and you'll have seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. Your seagrasses are the only true marine plants because they are the only ones that are fully submerged. Mangroves and salt marshes are only submerged part of the time. So let's talk about each one separately. So your seagrasses resemble grass that we have on land, but they're not actually a grass. They have evolved from land plants and are completely submerged. They do sexual reproduction using flowers. So they do produce flowers, and the flowers are pollinated by small crustaceans. And then, but generally speaking, majority of them are clones. So they will do asexual reproduction using the rhizomes, and they will create extensive meadows of seagrass. And typically you'll find these in tropics and subtropics. They need the warmer waters to survive, so you won't typically find them in the temperate or the polar regions. Mangroves are mainly tropics and subtropics. They also need warm weather to survive. They are land plants, and they tolerate a wide variety of salt concentrations along the coastline. So they primarily are along the coastline. Here in Hawaii, we do have a lot of mangroves, and unfortunately, they are invasive. So they typically are removed from the coastline, even though they do have some benefit to the coastline. They do stabilize the coastline and protect the coastline from erosion, from waves and wind, and they also create extensive habitats and nurseries for organisms. If you can see on the bottom right hand image there, you can see the root system is all very tightly packed together. And actually, look at the middle image. You can see this type of plant creates a lot of roots, and those roots create a lot of nooks and crannies for small little fish to hide in from their predators. So it's a really good place to raise young fish. And the only thing though is, if you notice the seeds in the left hand image there, they float, and they use the ocean current to get them from place to place. And they are very resilient plants. So that's the reason why here in Hawaii they are known as invasive, because they are very hard to kill. But yeah, either way, their roots have a specialized system in which they take in the water from the ocean and separate out the salt, and the salt then is released back into the environment. And lastly, you have salt marshes. So these are salt marsh plants are true members of the grass family, so they are grasses, unlike seagrasses. They do tolerate salt to varying degrees, and they are on the coastal region too, so much like the mangroves. So generally speaking, they won't be submerged underwater. They'll just be in on land. But at times of high tide, then they will get submerged, and either partially or fully, depending on how much water is coming in or what type of tide it is. They typically will be found in temperate and polar regions, so they prefer the colder temperatures over warmer temperatures. And they also have similar effects to mangroves in the sense that they protect the shoreline against erosion, but salt marshes also purify the water. So if the water comes in and is, say, a little bit silty or has some toxins in it, those salt marsh grasses will be able to extract those toxins and the sediment or silt that's in the water, and trap it within themselves. So they're very good at doing that. All right, so this chapter was really, really short, so stay tuned for chapter 7, which will be much longer, and it will cover marine invertebrates.